Thank you very much, Sir Nicholas. Last week, the nation was shocked by the revelation that in St Ives in Cornwall, 10 new cases of HIV had been discovered in the space of a single month. Headlines grew more hysterical as the story unfolded of a single perpetrator who had, perhaps knowingly, spread the infection through this small town. An expert team of medics was sent directly, a helpline was set up, 2 new testing clinics were established, and my honourable friend, the member for the constituency, issued a call for calm. My thoughts are with those 10 people and their families, whose anxiety must be unbearable at this time. However, it's not to belittle their suffering to say that for many families across the world, this is the reality every single day. In the UK, about 19 people are infected with HIV every single day. As my honourable friend said, this is still far too much, and indeed it is worrying if indeed this trend is increasing in recent years, and the messages that were so strongly accepted in the 1980s and early 90s, with the safe sex message getting through, are perhaps losing some of their resonance, and of course we are concerned about this. But compare that figure of 19 people in the UK every day being infected with the figure for Africa, which is 8,800. And even when you take into account the huge difference in population size, there is a clear disparity. Per capita, if the UK's infection rate was the same as Africa's, nearly 600 people every day in this country would be contracting HIV. And that would be a major public health emergency. We would be dealing with it at the highest levels of government. But of course, in Africa and in so many places in the world, there is a much bigger problem. In Botswana, for example, with one of the highest incidences of HIV, 37% of the adult population is HIV positive. And for these people, there will be no crack team of medics, no special clinic, no helpline, and their contraction of HIV is by no means headline news. The sad fact is that for many communities in Botswana and across the world, HIV is part of the daily reality. Having contracted the infection, those 10 people in St Ives can expect an average of £15,000 a year to be spent on their care. In Africa, the average per person is £7. The government's commitment to funding antiretroviral drugs must be commended, and indeed the work of the Minister and the Secretary of State in pushing this issue up the agenda is certainly to be congratulated. The UK is the world's second biggest bilateral donor on HIV and Aids, and in 2004 DIF had said that over the next 3 years the UK would spend at least £1.5 billion on AIDS-related work. However, it is already clear that this is by no means enough. In June 2005, UN AIDS and the World Health Organization estimated that 6.5 million people in developing countries needed immediate antiretroviral treatment, and of these, just 15% were receiving it. Whilst the government's commitment to aid is substantial, it is still out of balance with their spending on war. For example, the £1.5 billion pledged towards aid is dwarfed in comparison to the £3 billion spent already in the war in Iraq, which is set to rise to £5 billion by the end of the year. As a country, I believe we must redress this balance of our spending on war and aid. And 30 years late, we are yet to meet the UN target of increasing international aid to 0.7% of GMP, although I do welcome the government's commitment to meeting this within the coming years. But furthermore, in the developing world, war and health are inextricably linked. Aid to alleviate poverty and to improve health is an essential safeguard against the escalation of violence. Nowhere is this link between violence and the deterioration of health resources more glaring than in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Easily preventable diseases are rampant because the war has destroyed hospitals and the health infrastructure. The last report of the International Rescue Committee Aid Agency found that 1,000 people are dying there every day from conditions such as malaria and malnutrition, basic, easily preventable diseases. And when you put HIV and AIDS on top of that, you can see how the health services get stretched to the point where they just cannot cope. In Congo, there are 1.1 million HIV-positive people, which is about 4.5% of the population. And this report says the international humanitarian aid to the Congo has been abysmal compared to the response to other disasters. In 2003, for example, Iraq received aid worth the equivalent of £75 per person, but in the same year in Congo, there was just the equivalent of £1.70 per person. Now, there's some excellent aid projects underway there to support the testing and treatment of HIV, especially the work of the CDC Global AIDS Programme, but these projects need more money and more attention from the UK government. Various members have already spoken about the availability of antiretrovirals in the fight against AIDS. And obviously part of that is about the health infrastructure in developing countries. But part of it is also just about the access to drugs and being able to afford them. Unfortunately, the financial barriers faced by developing countries are not always simple. And the issue I think needs a lot of attention is TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. This is dealt with in paragraph 12 of the International Development Committee's report. Protection simply must be in place to exempt areas which impact on the Millennium Development Goals and global disease control. The current provisions have proved to be inadequate. We all remember the furore in 2001, where 39 major pharmaceutical companies tried to prosecute the South African government for passing a law that allowed easy production and importation of generic HIV drugs. There was a good ending to that particular incident because immense pressure from the South African government, the European Parliament, and not least 300,000 people from over 130 countries that signed a petition forced the pharmaceuticals to back down. So I do support the committee very strongly in their recommendation that the WTO must be persuaded to undertake a review of the implementation of TRIPS, and DFID should continue to work to build the capacity of developing countries to use TRIPS safeguards, like compulsory licences and government use provisions, to facilitate the production and export of affordable medicines, particularly second-line ARVs, which are increasingly important, especially as the disease becomes more resistant and the first-line ARVs are going to become less and less effective. And it's perhaps a sign of the difficulty that developing countries have of working within the TRIPS provisions that no compulsory licences have yet been issued. I'm also deeply concerned by the future of the agreement, which keeps sub-Saharan African countries immune from TRIPS plus agreements with the United States. These are the laws that go beyond the requirements of TRIPS to protect intellectual property. They're often drawn up as part of bilateral trade agreements with the US, usually involving the US promising better trade and investment to a particular country in exchange for that country introducing legislation to protect US intellectual property rights. But this may mean restrictions on compulsory licences or parallel importing. It could mean the extension of patents beyond the standard 20 years suggested by TRIPS. Currently, an executive order signed by President Bill Clinton in 2000 barred the US government from asking Southern African nations to sign such agreements. President Bush endorsed this when he came to office in 2001, but there is a danger that the Bush administration, faced with many generics plants now operating in Africa, will not necessarily keep its promise. And I would urge the UK government, if it wishes to stand by the promises made at Gleneagles, to make it clear that this would be an intolerable possibility. We are all aware of the extent of the problem with HIV and AIDS, and I do welcome this excellent report from the Select Committee and the spotlight that it is bringing to this issue. The government has made good progress, and that is certainly to be commended, and I hope government ministers will take on board the strength of interest in this issue, both from members of this House and from the wider public, because it is incredibly important that this is given a high priority within government.